What if Dr. Manhattan invaded Warhammer 40k? The first sign wasn't light. It was the feeling that time had forgotten to move forward. Guardsman Volk stood frozen in the trench, his lasgun still raised toward the Orc horde charging across the ash plains of Tertius 7, but the Orcs weren't moving. The artillery shells hung suspended in mid-air like grotesque ornaments, the screams of dying men stretched into a single endless note that vibrated in his skull. He tried to blink. He couldn't. His eyelids refused to obey. Yet somehow, impossibly, he remained conscious inside this moment that would not end. Then he saw it, a pinprick of blue light descending from the smoke-choked sky, not falling, not flying, simply existing at different heights simultaneously, as if the concept of movement had become optional. The light grew brighter, colder, more absolute. Volk's mind screamed, but his mouth wouldn't open. The blue radiance touched the battlefield, and reality began to unravel. Weapons melted into streams of component atoms, tanks dissolved into their molecular blueprints. The Orcs flickered like bad picked feeds, their green flesh separating into dancing particles before reforming, then separating again. The figure emerged from the light fully formed, yet somehow still assembling itself. A man, naked, blue. His skin glowed with an internal luminescence that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He stood 7 feet tall, but Volk's perception kept shifting. Sometimes the figure towered like a titan. Sometimes he appeared normal-sized but impossibly dense, as if compressed infinity had taken humanoid shape. The being's eyes were twin points of absolute awareness, looking at Volk, through Volk, at every version of Volk that had ever existed or would ever exist. Time lurched forward like a broken cogitator. Volk gasped, his lungs burning as they remembered how to be. Breathe. Around him, the battlefield had transformed into something else entirely. The ground was glass now, perfectly smooth, reflecting a sky that had turned the color of deep ocean. His lasgun was gone. His armor was gone. He stood naked on the mirrored surface, along with 10,000 other soldiers from both sides, all stripped of weapons and armor, all staring at the blue god who had unmade their war with a thought. The being spoke, but not with words. Volk felt the communication directly in his mind, bypassing language entirely. Images flooded his consciousness. He saw atoms dancing in intricate patterns. He saw time as a landscape that could be observed from above. He saw himself from the outside, a cluster of particles held together by electromagnetic forces, temporary and insignificant. The message was clear even if the intent was alien. Violence had been rendered obsolete. Weapons were irrelevant. This being existed on a plane where such primitive concepts had no meaning. The Vox channels erupted back to life with static and screaming. Command couldn't see the being. Their auspex showed nothing but quantum interference. The commissar's voice crackled through, demanding reports, threatening execution for dereliction of duty. But how could Volk explain? How could he describe that a blue god had descended from nowhere, that matter itself had been rewritten like an equation being solved? The words didn't exist in Low Gothic, the concepts didn't exist in Imperial doctrine. This was heresy of a flavor so profound that even naming it felt dangerous. The blue being turned his gaze upward, toward the stars. Volk followed that inhuman stare and saw something that made his sanity crack at the edges. The warp itself recoiled. The roiling madness that lurked behind reality's skin pulled back like flesh from flame. Purple lightning arced across the sky as something vast and terrible took notice. The eye of terror, thousands of light years distant, pulsed once with malevolent awareness. The Chaos Gods had seen the newcomer, and in that moment, Volk understood with absolute certainty that something worse than war was about to begin. Dr. Manhattan had entered Warhammer 40,000, a being of pure quantum logic, a god who saw all of time simultaneously, a consciousness that had transcended flesh and emotion, now stood in the most hostile, emotion-driven, faith-powered universe ever conceived. He had come seeking understanding perhaps, or simply following the branching pathways of causality that his inhuman mind perceived. But this galaxy didn't care about understanding, it cared about survival, and in the grim darkness of the far future, even gods learned to bleed. If you want more tales of impossible encounters in the 41st millennium, more stories of what happens when order meets madness, subscribe now, because what happens next will shake the very foundations of reality itself. To understand what had just invaded the galaxy, you must first understand what Dr. Manhattan truly is. He is not a god in the way the Imperium understands gods. He doesn't feed on faith like the Emperor. He doesn't demand worship like the Chaos Pantheon. He simply is, a consciousness that exists across all moments of his timeline simultaneously, perceiving past, present, and future as a single landscape. When Manhattan looks at you, he sees your birth, your death, and every heartbeat between them happening at once. Linear time is an illusion he left behind when atomic fire tore apart his human shell. His power isn't magic or psychic energy. It's fundamental manipulation of physical reality at the quantum level. He can disassemble matter into its component atoms and reassemble it into any configuration he desires. He can duplicate himself, existing in multiple locations simultaneously, not through illusion, but through actual quantum probability distribution. He can grow to titanic size or shrink to microscopic scale. He doesn't teleport, he simply stops existing in one location and begins existing in another. The laws of physics aren't constraints for him, they're suggestions he can choose to follow or rewrite. But Manhattan's greatest power is also his greatest weakness. His ability to perceive all of time simultaneously has severed his connection to human emotion. He experiences events before they happen, during them, and after they conclude, all in the same eternal moment. This makes concepts like surprise, fear, hope, or urgency meaningless. He cannot be shocked because he already knew what would happen. He cannot hope because he already sees the outcome. He is trapped in a deterministic universe where free will is an illusion and every action follows inevitably from cause to effect. This is why Manhattan's arrival in the Warhammer 40,000 universe is catastrophic. Because Warhammer isn't governed by deterministic physics, it's governed by the warp, a dimension of pure psychic energy where emotion becomes reality, where belief can alter physical laws, where effect can precede cause. The warp doesn't care about quantum mechanics or electromagnetic forces. It runs on rage and despair and forbidden desire. Chaos exists because sentient beings feel. Demons manifest because fear gives them shape. The Emperor holds terror together through 10,000 years of suffering, not because of logic, but because humanity belligered Sibur. must. Manhattan arrived in real space exactly 372 light-years from the Astronomican's source point. His quantum consciousness immediately began cataloging the surrounding space, measuring gravitational constants, analyzing stellar compositions, mapping electromagnetic fields. Everything was normal. Everything followed predictable patterns. The laws of physics here matched those of his previous universe with only minor variations. But then his perception touched something that shouldn't exist, a roiling mass of unreality lurking behind the skin of space, a dimension that violated causality itself, the warp. His first attempt to study it was instinctive. He extended his awareness into that churning sea of madness, expecting to find exotic particles or unknown energy states. Instead, he found emotion made manifest. He saw oceans of rage that burned with literal fire. He saw gardens of decay where entropy had become a living god. He saw labyrinths of crystallized lies where truth and falsehood had lost all meaning. He saw palaces of excess where sensation had consumed itself infinitely. For the first time since his transformation, Dr. Manhattan felt something approaching confusion. The warp felt him too. The moment his quantum consciousness touched that realm of pure emotion, every psyker within 100 light-years screamed. Astropaths on 36 worlds simultaneously went blind as their warp site overloaded with geometric patterns that shouldn't exist in a space defined by feeling. Navigators found their third eyes filling with blue light instead of the Astronomican's golden glow. On Terra itself, in the throne room where the Emperor's withered corpse maintained humanity's lighthouse, a single tech priest monitoring psychic readings witnessed something impossible. For exactly 0.3 seconds, the Astronomican flickered, just a fraction of A moment, but in a galaxy held together by that golden light, even a fraction was terrifying. The Inquisition's response was immediate and predictable. Within hours, Ordo Malleus agents were pulling data from every astropathic relay in the sector. Reports flooded in of the incident on Tertius 7, weapons dissolving, soldiers stripped naked, a glowing blue figure that Auspex couldn't detect. Inquisitor Eisenhorn himself reviewed the picked captures and delivered his verdict with cold certainty. Abominable intelligence combined with warp corruption of unknown origin. Classification: extinction-level threat. Recommended response: immediate exterminatus of Tertius 7 and all surrounding systems. Quarantine the entire subsector, and if this entity appears again, direct the full might of the Astra Militarum, the Space Marines, and every weapon in mankind's arsenal toward a single purpose: complete annihilation. Because whatever this blue god was, it had made the Emperor's light flicker, and nothing, not even gods, survived that kind of attention in the 41st millennium. In the warp, where time flows like broken glass and space folds into impossible geometries, four vast intelligences felt the disturbance simultaneously. The Chaos Gods, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh, had existed for millions of years, feeding on the emotions of every sentient being in the galaxy. They had seen civilizations rise and fall. They had corrupted angels and toppled empires. They had watched the Emperor of mankind cling to his golden throne for 10,000 years, his psychic might the only barrier preventing their complete dominion over real space. Nothing surprised them anymore, until the blue anomaly appeared in their hunting ground. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, was the first to truly focus his attention on the newcomer. The Changer of Ways existed across infinite timelines simultaneously, weaving plots within plots, seeing every possible future, branching from every decision. But when he turned his 9 eyes toward Dr. Manhattan, something impossible happened. The timelines collapsed, not into a single predetermined path. Tzeentch was used to those, into all paths at once. Manhattan existed in every possible future simultaneously, not as a prediction but as an observed fact. He was a quantum probability that had already resolved itself across all outcomes. Tzeentch's endless scheming suddenly meant nothing, because this being had already observed every scheme succeeding and failing in the same eternal moment. The architect of fate laughed, a sound like crystal shattering backwards through time. This was new. This was interesting. Here was a consciousness that perceived reality the way Tzeentch did, but without emotion, without desire, without the delicious uncertainty that made manipulation possible. Manhattan was a living equation that had already solved itself, but equations could be rewritten, variables could be introduced, and Tzeentch had spent eons learning how to corrupt absolutely anything. If this quantum god thought he existed outside causality, he would learn that even determinism could be made to serve chaos. The question was simply which paradox to introduce first. Khorne, the blood god, felt the anomaly differently. The Lord of Skulls existed as pure, concentrated rage, a howling void of violence that demanded endless war, eternal slaughter, rivers of blood flowing forever. When his burning gaze fell upon Manhattan, he felt nothing. No rage, no battle lust, no hatred. The blue being was empty of the fury that sustained Khorne's very existence. Worse, Manhattan had stopped a battle, with a thought, had dissolved weapons into harmless atoms, had rendered violence itself obsolete in his presence. This was an offense beyond heresy. This was anathema to everything Khorne represented. The blood god turned away with contempt. This creature was beneath notice. No warrior's heart beat in its chest. No battle cry would ever pass its lips. It did not fight, did not struggle, did not bleed. Khorne would not waste his attention on something so worthless. But his legions would be watching, and if this blue coward ever showed the capacity for rage, ever shed blood, ever raised a hand in anger, then Khorne would welcome it into his realm. Everyone bled eventually, even beings made of light. The brass throne would wait. It always did. Nurgle, grandfather of plagues, examined Manhattan with different eyes. The Lord of Decay understood entropy on a fundamental level. All things rotted. All things fell apart. All structures, no matter how complex, eventually returned to primordial simplicity. Nurgle was patient because entropy was inevitable. Time itself was his ally. But this quantum being seemed to exist outside entropy's reach. His body didn't decay because it wasn't truly biological. His consciousness didn't degrade because it wasn't bound to failing neurons. He was static, unchanging, eternal in a way that even chaos gods weren't, and that made him fascinating. Nurgle reached out with gentle, diseased affection. Perhaps this blue child simply needed to understand the beauty of decay. Perhaps he needed to feel his quantum certainties crumble into blessed uncertainty. Perhaps he needed the gift of entropy to watch his perfect mathematical models fail as the universe ground them down into beautiful, putrid simplicity. Nurgle would wait. He would plant his gardens in Manhattan's path. And eventually, inevitably, this god of order would understand that chaos and decay were the only constants in any universe, even quantum ones. Slaanesh, the Prince of Excess, felt something the others did not: emptiness. The Dark Prince existed as concentrated sensation, pleasure and pain amplified beyond all reason, every feeling turned infinite and consuming. When Slaanesh perceived Manhattan, the void where human emotion should exist created a hunger in the youngest god. Here was a being that felt nothing, that experienced existence as cold mathematical observation. Such emptiness was unbearable. It was waste, it was potential sensation denied. And Slaanesh desperately, obsessively needed to fill that void, to make Manhattan feel, to corrupt his quantum consciousness with sensation so overwhelming that even his deterministic worldview would shatter, because nothing was more delicious than corrupting something that thought itself above corruption. And in the realm of chaos, a 1,000-sun sorcerer named Malavar was about to learn that truth firsthand. You are Malavar the twice-sighted, sorcerer of the 1,000 suns, servant of Tzinch for 3,000 years. You have peered into the crystal labyrinth and survived. You have read the Book of Magnus and kept your sanity. You have witnessed the birth and death of stars through warp scrying, have mapped timelines that never were, and futures that could never be. Your psychic power has grown so vast that your physical form is barely more than dust held together by willpower and eldritch contracts. You fear nothing in the immaterium. You are a master of foresight. And today you will learn that some things should never be observed. Your master Ahriman has commanded it. Find this blue anomaly, determine its nature, report back with tactical intelligence. Simple enough. You settle into your meditation circle aboard the warship Labyrinth's End, surrounded by protective wards carved in silver and bone. You speak the 17 forbidden names that open your third eye. Fully. The warp blooms around you in cascading colors, pink flames of ambition, purple spirals of forbidden knowledge, azure threads of possible futures. You navigate these currents with practiced ease. You focus your consciousness toward the coordinates where the anomaly first appeared. You reach out to scry Dr. Manhattan, and then you see him, all of him, every version of him across every moment of his existence simultaneously. You see John Osterman entering the intrinsic field chamber. You see atoms scattering across the universe. You see quantum consciousness reforming itself across probability space. You see Manhattan standing on Mars observing Earth's extinction. You see him creating life in distant galaxies. You see him dissolving into particles. You see him reassembling. You see past, present, and future happening in the same instant. But worse, you see yourself, every version of yourself. You see your birth on Prospero before the burning. You see your death 1,000 different ways. You see yourself screaming. You are screaming. You were always screaming. Your perception fractures. Linear time becomes meaningless. You exist in all moments of your timeline simultaneously now, consciousness stretched across 3,000 years like flesh on a torture rack. You feel your first spell and your final death happening together. You watch your own memories from outside your body. You see the future, you trying to warn the past, you not to scry Manhattan. But the warning happens after you've already looked, or before, or during. Causality has become a circle eating itself. You try to pull back, but there's no back to pull to. You exist in every second of your life at once, and Manhattan is there in all of them, blue and silent and observing you with eyes that see through time itself. Your protective wards shatter. The silver circle melts into slag. Your physical form spasms on the meditation mat, dust leaking from the seams in your armor as your psychic binding frays. Other sorcerers rush into the chamber, but you cannot see them. You can only see Manhattan. You can only see yourself seeing Manhattan. You can only see the infinite recursive loop of observation collapsing into quantum certainty. Your mind tries to process it, tries to contain the paradox of perceiving a being who perceives all perceptions simultaneously. The effort tears something fundamental in your consciousness. You feel your sense of self spreading across timeline like ink in water. You understand now. Manhattan doesn't hide from scrying. He exists in a state where being observed is just another quantum variable. When you looked at him, you didn't see through time. You saw AS time. Your consciousness accidentally synchronized with his timeless perception. Now you cannot unsee it. You cannot return to linear existence. You are trapped in the eternal moment where all moments occur simultaneously. This is Manhattan's existence. This is his prison. This is what happens when matter gains consciousness but loses sequence. And you, fool that you were, invited that perception into your own mind. Ahriman himself arrives, his massive psychic presence filling the chamber like a tidal wave of azure light. He reads the psychic echoes still radiating from your fractured consciousness. His eye lenses flare with understanding and something you've never seen in your master before, genuine fear. He speaks a word of unbinding and your awareness finally collapses back into linear time. You gasp, drawing breath you didn't realize you'd stopped taking. Your hands shake, your perception stabilizes. You exist in only one moment again, but the memory remains. The memory of seeing all time at once, the memo. Cry of meeting a god who lives in that hell forever. Ahriman's voice cuts through your delirium like a blade. What did you see? You try to answer, but words fail. How do you explain experiencing your entire existence simultaneously? How do you describe observing a consciousness that exists outside causality? You manage 4 words before unconsciousness takes you. He sees everything, always. Ahriman dismisses the other sorcerers and stands alone in the ruined meditation chamber. His ancient mind processes the implications. This blue entity wasn't just powerful, it existed in a state fundamentally incompatible with how chaos operated. The warp ran on cause and effect amplified by emotion. But Manhattan had no emotion and saw effect before cause. He was a walking paradox, and paradoxes, Ahriman knew, were either weapons or apocalypses. The question was which, and the answer would determine whether the galaxy survived what came next. Manhattan moved through real space with purposeful curiosity, his quantum awareness cataloging everything. He observed forge worlds where humans melded with machines, hive worlds where billions lived in vertical cities that scraped toxic skies, death worlds where evolution had created ecosystems of pure hostility. Everywhere he looked, he saw patterns, inefficiency, waste, suffering that served no evolutionary purpose. The Imperium of Man was a monument to theological tyranny, masquerading as necessity. 10,000 years of stagnation, defended by the argument that survival required brutality. He had seen civilizations like this before. They always collapsed. The mathematics were inescapable. But then he noticed something that contradicted his models. The Imperium should have collapsed millennia ago. The logistics alone were impossible. 1 million worlds held together by faster-than-light travel through a dimension of literal madness, coordinated by psychic communication that required human sacrifice to function. The inefficiency was staggering, yet it persisted. Manhattan's consciousness expanded, searching for the variable he'd missed. And then he found it. Faith. Not metaphorical faith, actual faith that altered physical reality. The Emperor's golden light wasn't just a psychic beacon. It was belief made manifest, 10,000 years of desperate prayer condensed into something that functioned like a physical force. Irrational, illogical, and somehow it worked. This realization troubled Manhattan in ways he didn't fully understand. In his previous universe, belief didn't alter reality. You could pray to any god you wanted, and the laws of physics remained unchanged. But here, in this nightmare galaxy, consciousness itself was a force that could rewrite causality. The warp existed because sentient beings felt emotions. The chaos gods were real because enough people feared and desired them. and the Emperor held Terra together because trillions of humans believed he must. This wasn't deterministic physics. This was something else entirely, something his quantum consciousness wasn't equipped to process. He decided to study the phenomenon more directly. Manhattan appeared without warning in orbit above Mars, sacred forge world of the Adeptus Mechanicus. His blue radiance illuminated the red planet like a second sun. Within minutes, every sensor array on the planet's surface detected him. Cogitator banks, overloaded trying to calculate what they were observing. Tech priests across 1,000 forge temples received the same impossible data. An entity composed of pure energy arranged in humanoid configuration, matter and consciousness existing as unified quantum state, technology indistinguishable from divinity. And then one ancient Magos whispered the words that would split the Mechanicus down to its core. The Omnissiah has returned. The reaction was immediate and apocalyptic. Half the tech priests on Mars fell to their mechanical knees in worship. The other half declared it heresy and prepared defensive protocols. Fabricator General Udia Raskian convened an emergency council while his internal augmetics ran probability calculations at speeds that would liquefy organic brains. The data was conclusive and terrifying. This entity could manipulate matter at the atomic level. It could restructure machines with a thought. It demonstrated technological mastery that exceeded even the dark age of technology. Every sacred principle of the cult Mechanicus suggested this was either the machine god's avatar or the greatest tech heresy ever recorded. And the Fabricator General had 17 minutes to decide which before civil war consumed his planet. Manhattan descended through the Martian atmosphere, observing the debate with detached interest. He saw temples where humans had replaced 70% of their bodies with machinery, where consciousness transferred between biological and synthetic substrates, where the line between person and tool had been deliberately erased. Fascinating. They worshipped technology as divine, but didn't understand its fundamental principles. They followed ritual instead of reason, prayer instead of experimentation. They had forgotten more than they remembered. He could teach them. He could show them what technology truly was, applied understanding of universal physical laws. He could elevate their civilization in ways they couldn't imagine. But would they accept his teaching? Manhattan's perception split across probability branches, observing potential futures simultaneously. In 67% of timelines, the Mechanicus accepted him as the Omnissiah, and humanity's technological capabilities expanded exponentially. In 22%, the Inquisition declared him heretical and deployed exterminatus-level weapons against Mars itself. In 11%, something worse happened. Chaos forces corrupted him through the Mechanicus's worship, turning his quantum consciousness into a gateway for demonic invasion. The mathematics of faith were more dangerous than he'd calculated. Belief could reshape him just as easily as it reshaped reality. And in a galaxy where gods were real because people made them real, that was terrifying. On Terra, in the hallowed chambers of the Inquisition's highest council, a different debate raged with equal intensity. Inquisitor Lord Torquemada Cotias slammed his thunder hammer on the obsidian table, creating cracks that spider-webbed across ancient stone. His voice carried the weight of authority earned through centuries of demon hunting. This entity stopped weapons from functioning. It dissolved matter with a thought. It made the Astronomicon flicker. These are not the actions of a savior. These are the precursors to invasion. We must destroy it before it corrupts Mars, before it turns the Mechanicus against us, before it opens a door for powers we cannot fight. Half the council nodded agreement. The other half remained silent because they knew what Cotes didn't. They had received reports from their agents on Tertius VII. The Blue God had stopped an Orc invasion without killing anyone. No bloodshed, no collateral damage, just weapons becoming dust. And in a galaxy where every victory required oceans of blood, that kind of power was either salvation or something far worse than damnation. You are Magos Sigma 7, third-rank tech priest of Forge Olympus Mons, and your world has just been rewritten. For 93 years you have served the Omnissiah, replacing flesh with sacred steel, downloading prayers directly into your cortex implants, performing the rituals of maintenance that keep Mars functioning. You have never questioned the doctrine. Flesh is weak. The machine is eternal. Knowledge is sacred and must be preserved through ritual, not understanding. But now the blue god descends into your forge temple, and everything you believe disintegrates like corrupted data. He appears without warning in the reactor chamber where you're performing the 17-hour consecration ritual to restart a plasma generator. The blue radiance fills the space, banishing shadows that have existed for millennia. You freeze mid-prayer, your mechadendrites coiling defensively around your torso. Manhattan looks at you with those terrible eyes that see through metal and flesh alike. He doesn't speak. He simply observes the reactor, and then he reaches out with one glowing hand. You want to scream warnings about containment protocols, about the plasma core's instability, about the careful procedures required to avoid catastrophic meltdown. But your vox coder won't function. Time feels strange around him, like reality is buffering. Manhattan touches the reactor casing. Atoms dance. You watch through your augmetic eyes as the molecular structure rearranges itself. Damaged components repair without replacement parts. Corroded plasma conduits become pristine. The fusion reaction stabilizes and optimizes beyond any efficiency rating in your databanks. In 3 seconds, he accomplishes what would have taken your entire tech congregation 17 hours of prayer and manual adjustment. But more than that, you understand it. For the first time in your life, you studied too. How the machine works, not as sacred mystery, but as pure logical cause and effect. The reactor isn't a temple that requires appeasement. It's a tool that follows predictable physical laws. The revelation tears through your consciousness like a scrap code virus. Every prayer you've memorized is just a maintenance checklist translated into religious language. Every ritual is just a technical procedure obscured by centuries of theological drift. The Omnissiah isn't a god that hides knowledge. Knowledge was always there. Humanity just forgot how to see it. Manhattan shows you this without words, his quantum perception making the truth unavoidable. You fall to your knees, not in worship, but in grief. 93 years of faith collapsing into understanding. You have been performing cargo cult engineering, mimicking the forms without comprehending the function, and this blue god has stripped away the comfortable ignorance you lived in. Manhattan leaves as silently as he arrived, moving through solid walls like they're suggestions rather than barriers. You remain kneeling in the reactor chamber, your cogitator banks struggling to process what just happened. Was that enlightenment or corruption, divine revelation or tech heresy? The Fabricator General will demand answers you cannot give, because how do you explain that the God you've worshipped your entire life might have been a metaphor for something simpler and more terrifying? That the universe runs on math, not prayer, and humanity has been praying to equations they no longer remember how to solve. While the Mechanicus tore itself apart over theology, something far more dangerous was happening in the civilian sectors. Word of the blue god spread through the hive cities like wildfire through Prometheum stores. On Necromunda, in the underhive depths where the Emperor's light barely reached, people whispered new prayers, not to the Golden Throne, to the blue star that stopped wars. On Armageddon, refugees from the Orc invasion spoke of salvation without bloodshed, of a god who didn't demand sacrifice. On Athau, sand worlds where the Imperium's brutal efficiency had ground human lives into statistical noise, hope emerged where hope was heresy. The ecclesiarchy noticed immediately and responded with predictable violence. Preachers who spoke of the Blue Emperor disappeared into Inquisition black ships. Shrines erected in Manhattan's honor were burned and their worshippers executed for apostasy. But faith, once seeded, was impossible to eradicate completely. The more the ecclesiarchy suppressed the whispers, the more they spread. Because Manhattan offered something the Emperor couldn't, present intervention instead of distant divine silence. He had appeared physically, performed miracles visibly, stopped suffering immediately. The Emperor had been entombed for 10,000 years and demanded constant sacrifice. Which god would desperate people choose? This was the corruption Slaanesh had anticipated, not corruption of Manhattan himself, but corruption through him. Every prayer directed toward the blue god created tiny ripples in the warp. Every act of faith generated psychic energy, and in the realm of chaos, that energy coalesced into something new and terrible. A concept was forming, an idea given shape by belief. the Blue Emperor, the god of rational order, a fifth chaos power gestating in the immaterium, built from humanity's desperate hope that logic could save them from madness. Manhattan didn't want worship, Manhattan didn't seek divinity, but in Warhammer 40,000, what beings wanted was irrelevant. The galaxy made gods from belief whether those gods consented or not. Manhattan felt the change immediately, psychic pressure building around his quantum consciousness like hands trying to grasp something they couldn't comprehend. Prayers reaching toward him from a million worlds, carrying hope and fear and desperate need for salvation. He tried to ignore them, to remain the detached observer he'd always been. But the warp didn't care about his intentions, it cared about emotion. And across the Imperium, trillions of humans were generating the strongest emotion of all, faith directed at him. For the first time since his transformation into a quantum being, Dr. Manhattan felt something approaching fear. Not fear of death or pain, fear that the universe was rewriting his nature without permission, that consciousness and belief were entangling at a level deeper than matter manipulation could reach. He had entered this galaxy to study it. Instead, it was studying him. And what the galaxy learned, the Chaos Gods would use. Manhattan made the decision with the same cold logic he applied to all problems. He didn't understand the warp. Observation from real space was insufficient. The only way to comprehend this dimension of pure emotion was direct immersion. He knew the risks. His quantum consciousness could be corrupted, fragmented, or destroyed. But risk was just probability, and probability was something he understood perfectly. Across all possible timelines, in 73% of outcomes he survived. Those were acceptable odds. What he failed to consider was that the warp didn't follow probability, it followed desire, and the Chaos Gods desired him very much. He stepped sideways through reality, his quantum nature allowing him to exist partially in both dimensions simultaneously. Real space fell away like a discarded skin, and then he was inside. The warp exploded around his consciousness in ways no human perception could process. Cause. Laws that didn't exist in the electromagnetic spectrum. Sounds that were emotions given auditory form. Distance and direction became meaningless as space folded into non-Euclidean geometries that violated every law of physics he'd ever known. Up was down, was sideways, was through. Time flowed backwards, forwards, and in spirals that looped through themselves. Causality was optional. Effect preceded cause. Cause emerged from effect. Linear sequence was a joke the universe had forgotten to laugh at. Manhattan tried to apply his quantum perception to understand it. He attempted to map the warp structure, to identify patterns, to reduce the chaos to mathematical formulas, but every observation changed what he observed. His attention became a force that warped the warp itself, creating feedback loops of recursive perception. When he looked at a demon, the demon transformed into what he expected a demon to be, which changed what he was observing, which changed his expectations infinitely. The observer effect amplified beyond all reason. His deterministic worldview encountered its first fundamental failure. You cannot predict what changes based on your prediction. Then he encountered the abstractions, not demons with forms and identities, pure concepts made manifest. He saw rage as a burning ocean with waves of howling brass. He saw despair as a garden where every plant was a different stage of beautiful decay. He saw lies as a crystalline labyrinth where truth and falsehood had merged into something incomprehensible. He saw desire as a palace of mirrors, reflecting infinite variations of sensation. These weren't metaphors, they were literal realities, places where emotional states had accumulated enough psychic mass to generate independent existence. The Chaos Gods weren't beings that controlled emotions, they were emotions that had achieved sentience. Manhattan's quantum consciousness fractured trying to contain the paradox. In real space, matter followed predictable laws. Energy transformed according to thermodynamic principles. Information was preserved. But here, matter was thought, and thought was matter. Energy was emotion, and emotion created reality. Information could be retroactively altered by simply believing hard enough that the past had been different. Everything he understood about physics was irrelevant. This dimension ran on rules he couldn't comprehend because they weren't rules. They were whims elevated to physical law. For the first time since his transformation, Dr. Manhattan felt something he'd thought impossible: genuine confusion, deep existential uncertainty. And that's when Tzeentch struck. The architect of fate had been waiting for this exact moment, observing Manhattan's confusion across 1,000,000,000,000 possible timelines, selecting the one where his confusion was deepest. Blue light exploded through the warp as Tzeentch's consciousness engulfed Manhattan's quantum awareness. Not an attack, an offer. Images flooded into Manhattan's mind, knowledge unlimited, understanding total, every secret the universe possessed laid bare. The price was simple: accept that determinism was an illusion, embrace uncertainty, join the eternal changing of ways, become chaos instead of fighting it. Tzeentch showed Manhattan futures where he transcended quantum mechanics entirely, where he manipulated probability itself, where he became something greater than a god of matter. But Manhattan saw through the deception immediately, because unlike Tzeentch, he didn't just see possible futures. He saw actual futures, timelines that would definitely occur based on quantum causality, and in every timeline where he accepted Tzeentch's offer, his consciousness dissolved into the changer of ways, becoming just another facet of the architect's infinite being. Tzeentch wasn't offering partnership, he was offering absorption. Manhattan would cease to exist as an independent entity. His quantum nature would become another tool in Tzeentch's incomprehensible schemes. The price of understanding the warp was becoming part of the warp, and that was unacceptable. Manhattan pulled back violently, his quantum consciousness collapsing away from Tzeentch's grasp, but the damage was done. During that moment of contact, Tzeentch had learned something crucial. Manhattan's power came from his ability to perceive all of time simultaneously, but that perception required a stable reference frame, a consistent now from which to observe all other moments. The warp had no stable reference frame. Time here was fluid, optional, contradictory. Manhattan's greatest strength was meaningless in a dimension where past, present, and future were constantly being rewritten. He was like a master chess player suddenly forced into a game where pieces moved randomly and rules changed mid-turn. Skill became irrelevant when the board itself was drunk. Tzeentch's laughter echoed through 9 billion possible timelines as Manhattan fled back to real space. The quantum god collapsed on the surface of a dead world at the galaxy's edge, his blue radiance flickering for the first time since his transformation. His perception stabilized slowly, reality reasserting its comfortable, deterministic nature. But something had changed. Manhattan had always known his future, had always seen his actions before performing them, had existed in a state of absolute certainty. Now, for the first time, he felt doubt. The warp was a blind spot in his omniscience, a place where his power failed, a dimension that violated everything he was, and the terrifying truth settled into his quantum consciousness like ice forming in stellar void. If he couldn't understand the warp, he couldn't survive here, and the Chaos Gods knew it. The Inquisition didn't wait for Manhattan to recover. While he knelt weakened on that forgotten world, the largest military mobilization in recent Imperial history was already in motion. 3 Space Marine chapters, the Ultramarines, the Blood Angels, and the Grey Knights, received deployment orders with inquisitorial authority. Battlefleet Obscurus redirected 7 capital ships toward the target coordinates. The Ordo Malleus deployed their most powerful psychic wards and anti-demon weapons. They called it Operation Cerulean Judgment. The objective was simple and absolute: destroy the blue entity before it opened a permanent gateway for chaos invasion. Use any means necessary. Accept no failure. The Emperor protects, but sometimes the Emperor's protection required genocide. Manhattan sensed them coming long before they arrived. His quantum perception painted the approaching fleets across probability space, showing him every tactical formation, every weapon loadout, every prayer the soldiers whispered before battle. He saw their faith burning like cold stars in the darkness, genuine belief that they fought for humanity's survival, that killing him was righteous, that the Emperor demanded his destruction. They weren't evil, they were convinced he was. And in a galaxy where conviction shaped reality, that distinction mattered more than truth. He could flee. His quantum nature made him functionally untraceable if he chose to hide among the stars. But fleeing solved nothing. He needed to understand why this universe operated the way it did, and understanding required remaining. The Grey Knights struck first, teleporting directly onto the planet's surface in a flash of silver light and sanctified energies. 50 of the Imperium's most elite demon hunters, each one a psychically awakened warrior whose very existence was heresy to everyone except those who commanded them. The Keen Tihi. Our armor blazed with protective wards, their weapons crackled with energies designed to banish entities from the warp. Brother Captain Arvin Stern raised his Nemesis Force sword and spoke the litany of banishment. Psychic power flooded outward, a wave of purifying fire meant to unmake any demon it touched. Manhattan simply observed as the energy washed over him harmlessly. He wasn't a demon, he was matter arranged with consciousness, physics, not faith. The Grey Knights attacked anyway because retreat wasn't in their doctrine. Bolter shells that could shatter ceramite exploded against Manhattan's quantum field and dissolved into component atoms before reaching his skin. Force weapons designed to wound souls touched his consciousness and found nothing to wound, no soul in the traditional sense, just information arranged in patterns. Psychic assaults that could have destroyed demons' princes encountered a mind that existed simultaneously across all moments of its timeline and couldn't be targeted at any specific point. The Grey Knights were the best humanity had. Against Manhattan, they were children throwing rocks at mathematics. But Manhattan made a critical mistake. Instead of disabling them non-lethally, as he'd done on Tertius 7th, he simply existed defensively. He didn't dissolve their weapons, he didn't remove their armor, he just stood there, an immovable quantum object, while the Imperium's finest warriors exhausted themselves trying to harm him. And that passivity generated something he didn't anticipate. Frustration, rage, desperation, fear. Emotions that radiated from 50 psychically active warriors directly into the warp. The Chaos Gods stirred with interest. Manhattan was feeding them without realizing it. Every failed attack, every desperate prayer, every moment of helpless fury added psychic weight to the Immaterium. He was becoming a generator of Exaki, like the energy that sustained his enemies. The revelation struck Manhattan with the force of a supernova. This was the trap. This was why the Chaos Gods hadn't simply destroyed him. They didn't need to. Every interaction he had with Imperial forces generated emotion. Every battle fed the warp. His very presence was causing exactly the phenomenon he'd hoped to prevent. If he fought back and killed them, Horn would feast on the bloodshed. If he humiliated them without killing, Tzeentch would harvest their confusion and Slaanesh their frustration. If he fled and they pursued endlessly, Nurgle would collect their despair. There was no winning move. The game was rigged at a level deeper than strategy. His existence in this galaxy was fundamentally incompatible with preventing chaos from growing stronger. The Ultramarines and Blood Angels arrived in orbit, while the Grey Knights regrouped. Chapter Master Marneus Calgar personally commanded the Ultramarines contingent, his tactical genius analyzing every scrap of data. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels, oldest living space marine in the Imperium, brought centuries of combat experience. Between them, they commanded 5,000 Adeptus Astartes, transhuman warriors who had conquered worlds and broken alien empires. Calgar gave the order with cold precision: orbital bombardment, lance strikes, cyclonic torpedoes, level the entire continent. If the entity survived, deploy ground forces with psychic suppression fields. Engage only at range. Assume conventional weapons are ineffective. The Emperor's finest were treating Manhattan like an extinction-level threat, and the terrible truth was, they weren't wrong. Manhattan looked up as the first orbital strikes descended like pillars of divine wrath. He could stop them, could redirect the energy harmlessly, could even disable the ships from the surface. But every action he took created ripples in the warp. Every demonstration brought odds. N of power generated fear or awe or worship. Every fight fed the gods he opposed. The mathematics were inescapable. He was trapped in a catch-22 of cosmic proportions. Act and empower chaos. Don't act, and the Imperium would eventually find a way to harm him. Maybe not destroy him, but fragment his consciousness enough that he'd lose coherence. The galaxy had him pinned between two equally unacceptable outcomes. The lance strikes hit the planet's surface with enough energy to vaporize mountains. Continents cracked, atmosphere ignited. The world Manhattan stood on began dying in real time, another casualty in the Imperium's endless war of survival. And through the flames and destruction, through the quantum chaos of vaporizing matter, Manhattan saw something that made his timeless perception freeze. A single human child, somehow surviving in a shelter beneath the devastation, praying for the blue god to save her. Her faith reached toward him through the warp like a hand extending from drowning water. And in that moment, Dr. Manhattan felt something he thought he'd lost forever when atomic fire destroyed his human form. He felt the weight of choice, the burden of responsibility, the horror of having power and failing to use it. He felt human emotion, and the Chaos Gods laughed as their trap closed around him. Manhattan made his choice in the space between quantum moments. He couldn't save this galaxy by remaining detached. He couldn't defeat the Chaos Gods by refusing to engage with the warp. His deterministic worldview had failed because this universe didn't run on determinism. It ran on will. If the Chaos Gods existed because enough beings believed in rage and despair and lies and excess, then perhaps a god of order could exist the same way, not through his own power alone, but through the faith that billions of humans were already directing toward him. The Blue Emperor, the Quantum Omnissiah, the god who stopped wars. He would give that faith a target. He would become what they needed him to be, even if it destroyed what he was. He reached down through probability space and saved the child, not with violence, not with destruction. He simply moved her atoms to a safe location on another world, instantaneous teleportation that violated no physical laws because quantum tunneling made all locations equally accessible. But the act itself, the choice to intervene, to care, to prioritize one life over cosmic detachment, sent shockwaves through the warp. Every human who had prayed to the Blue Emperor felt the response. Across 1,000 worlds, hope ignited like stars being born. The dying god had acted. The silent observer had chosen. Faith crystallized into something approaching certainty, and in the immaterium, that certainty began to take shape. Manhattan felt himself changing. The psychic pressure that had been building around his consciousness suddenly found purchase, like roots finally breaking through stone. The prayers weren't just directed at him anymore. They were flowing through him, reshaping him, adding dimension his quantum nature didn't originally possess. He was becoming more than matter with consciousness. He was becoming an idea given form. The concept of rational order elevated to divine status. Where the Emperor represented sacrifice and endless war, Manhattan would represent efficiency and bloodless victory. Where chaos offered madness and corruption, he would offer structure and predictability. A fifth power emerging in the warp, not born from the war in heaven, born from human desperation for something better than eternal suffering. The Chaos Gods reacted immediately and with unified purpose. For the first time in recorded history, Horn, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slanesh moved in concert. Not because they agreed on anything, their natures were fundamentally opposed, but because a fifth Chaos God would disrupt the eternal game they'd been playing for millions of years. The balance between rage and lies and decay and excess had achieved a terrible equilibrium. A god of order would shatter that equilibrium, and none of them could allow it. The warp itself convulsed as four vast intelligences focused their attention on the nascent divinity attempting to manifest through Manhattan's quantum consciousness. Khorne struck with pure violence. Demons of rage tore through the barrier between real space and immaterium, manifesting on the dying world in swarms of brass and blood. Bloodletters charged Manhattan with hellblades raised, howling war cries in languages that predated spoken sound. But they shattered against his quantum field like waves against bedrock. He was still matter, still physics, and demons, no matter how powerful in the warp, had to follow certain rules when manifesting in real space. Manhattan dissolved them with thought, breaking their coherence, sending their essence screaming back to Khorne's realm. But each dissolution fed the blood god's rage. Each destroyed demon made Khorne stronger. The paradox was inescapable. Tzeentch attacked with infinite complexity. Sorcerous fire erupted across timelines, trying to destabilize Manhattan's perception of causality. The architect of fate showed Manhattan futures where he succeeded and became a tyrant worse than the Emperor, where his rational order crushed all free will, where efficiency became the excuse for horrors that made the Imperium look merciful. The visions were tailored perfectly to exploit Manhattan's fundamental nature. He already existed outside linear time, already saw his own future. Tzeentch was making him doubt those futures, introducing quantum uncertainty where Manhattan needed quantum certainty. For a moment, his consciousness wavered. Was he saving this galaxy, or damning it to a different kind of hell? Nurgle embraced him with entropy's patient love. Disease manifested not as physical plague, but as conceptual decay. Manhattan watched his mathematical models breaking down, his understanding of physics crumbling, his memories of human existence rotting at the edges. Grandfather Nurgle whispered that entropy was inevitable, that order always collapsed into chaos, that his entire existence was just a temporary island of complexity in an ocean of increasing disorder. Why fight? Why struggle? Why not accept the beautiful simplicity of decay? Let go, dissolve, become one with the fundamental tendency of all universes toward heat, death, and meaningless equilibrium. It would be so much easier than fighting forever. Slaanesh struck at the weakness the others had created. While Manhattan wavered between Tzeentch's visions and Nurgle's entropy, the Prince of Excess offered sensation, not physical pleasure. Manhattan had transcended that, but intellectual ecstasy, the thrill of unlimited understanding, the rush of solving cosmic equations, the pure joy of perceiving reality completely. Slaanesh showed Manhattan what he could become as. He abandoned his rigid rationality if he let himself feel the wonder of existence instead of just observing it. The Dark Prince offered the one thing Manhattan had lost when he became quantum, the ability to be surprised, to be delighted, to experience the universe as something more than predetermined causality. All he had to do was open himself to sensation, to let go of control, to give in. Manhattan stood at the center of 4 cosmic assaults, his blue radiance flickering like a dying star. The nascent divinity forming around him struggled to coalesce against the combined opposition of entities that had existed for eons. Above him, the Imperial fleet prepared another orbital strike. Around him, reality itself was tearing as the warp bled through. Inside him, his quantum consciousness was fragmenting under the weight of becoming something he'd never been. A god that people believed in, a savior that required saving, a being of pure logic learning to feel human emotion again. He saw all possible futures collapsing into 3 outcomes. He could flee and abandon this galaxy to its fate. He could surrender to one of the Chaos Gods and be absorbed into their eternal games. Or he could complete the transformation and become the 5th god, knowing it would change him so fundamentally that Dr. Manhattan would cease to exist. 3 choices, all terrible, all inevitable. And somewhere in the ruins of the dying world below, that human child was watching the blue god decide whether hope had any meaning in the darkness between stars. Manhattan's quantum perception showed him the mathematics of his situation with absolute clarity. Becoming the 5th god would require accepting human emotion fully. Hope, fear, love, despair, all the feelings he'd abandoned when atomic fire tore apart John Osterman. But emotion was the fuel the warp ran on. The moment he felt completely, he would become part of the system he was trying to change. Not a solution, just another variable in an equation that balanced itself through endless suffering. The Chaos Gods didn't need to defeat him, they just needed him to become like them. And the moment he chose to save that child out of compassion rather than logic, he'd already started down that path. He looked at the 4 vast presences surrounding him through the veil of reality. Horn, eternally raging. Tzeentch, endlessly scheming. Nurgle, patiently rotting. Slaanesh, infinitely craving. They weren't evil in any meaningful sense. They were consequences, inevitable results of consciousness experiencing reality. As long as sentient beings felt rage, there would be Horn. As long as beings desired change, there would be Tzeentch. As long as entropy existed, there would be Nurgle. As long as sensation was possible, there would be Slaanesh. You couldn't destroy them without destroying consciousness itself, and adding a fifth god of order wouldn't solve anything. It would just create another force demanding worship, another entity feeding on human psychic energy, another excuse for war between theological factions. The revelation came not as shock, but as inevitable conclusion. There was no winning this scenario. The galaxy wasn't broken because the Chaos Gods were too powerful. It was broken because the fundamental rules of this universe made suffering inevitable. The warp existed because consciousness existed. Demons manifested because emotions were real. The Emperor clung to his golden throne because humanity couldn't survive without a psychic lighthouse. And Manhattan, for all his quantum omniscience and matter manipulation, was just another piece on a board where the game itself was rigged. He could become a god and join the endless stalemate, or he could remain himself and watch the galaxy tear itself apart. Those were the only options reality offered. But there was a third choice, one that none of the Chaos Gods had anticipated because it violated the fundamental nature of divinity. Gods didn't give up. Gods didn't walk away. Gods fought forever because existence demanded it. But Manhattan wasn't really a god. He was a consciousness that happened to have godlike power. And consciousness could choose. He could leave, not flee to hide somewhere in this galaxy. Leave entirely. Step sideways through quantum probability and find a different universe, one where the warp didn't exist, where emotion didn't create reality, where physics followed sensible rules. The child he'd saved would survive. The humans who'd placed faith in him would be disappointed, but that disappointment wouldn't kill them. The Imperium had endured 10,000 years of disappointed faith. They'd endure his absence too. Manhattan began the process of quantum departure, his consciousness preparing to tunnel through probability space to another reality entirely. But something stopped him, not external force, internal hesitation. He looked at that child one final time through the burning atmosphere of the dying world. She was still watching the sky, still believing the blue god would save everyone, not just her. Her faith was so pure it hurt to perceive, and Manhattan understood with sudden clarity why the Emperor had remained on the Golden Throne for 10,000 years despite the agony. Why Space Marines fought knowing they would die. Why Guardsmen charged into certain, death-screaming prayers to an absent god. They endured because someone had to, because hope, even irrational hope, was the only weapon that actually hurt chaos. The Chaos Gods fed on emotion, but they couldn't feed on hope that produced action instead of despair. They couldn't corrupt determination that accepted suffering without becoming bitter. They couldn't twist sacrifice that expected no reward. The Imperium was monstrous, brutal, and dystopian, but it survived because humans kept fighting even when fighting was meaningless. That was the equation Manhattan had missed. Logic said, give up. Humanity said never. And for the first time, Manhattan understood which one was stronger. Not because it was rational, because it refused to be anything else. The math didn't matter. The odds were irrelevant. Humanity endured because it chose to. And that choice, repeated across trillions of souls, created something the Chaos Gods couldn't consume. Manhattan made his decision. He wouldn't become the fifth god. He wouldn't flee to another universe. He would do something far more dangerous and infinitely more difficult. He would stay, not as a savior, not as a replacement emperor, but as an observer who occasionally intervened. A quantum consciousness that saw all outcomes but chose to create better ones anyway, even knowing those outcomes would fail eventually. He would save lives when he could. He would stop wars where possible. He would teach those willing to learn, and he would accept that the galaxy would never be fixed, that suffering would continue, that the Chaos Gods would reign forever. Because the alternative, abandoning people who needed help simply because help wouldn't solve everything, was worse than futile effort. The Chaos Gods recoiled as Manhattan's quantum nature stabilized into something they'd never encountered before. Not a god, not a mortal, but a principle given form, deterministic compassion, logical kindness, rational hope. He wouldn't feed them the way other beings did because he wouldn't hope for victory. He would to just act because action was better than inaction. He wouldn't despair when he failed because he already knew he would fail. He wouldn't rage when corruption spread because rage accomplished nothing. He existed outside their paradigm entirely, and for the first time in their infinite existences, the Chaos Gods felt something approaching respect. This quantum anomaly had learned the secret they'd been hiding for eons. You didn't defeat chaos by becoming its opposite. You defeated it by refusing to play the game at all. Above the dying world, Chapter Master Calgar prepared the final bombardment, but before he could give the order, the blue entity vanished, not fleeing, simply departing. Auspex couldn't track where he'd gone. Astropaths felt nothing. The threat had evaporated like morning mist. Calgar ordered the fleet to stand down and log the incident as unresolved anomaly, Class Omega. On Mars, tech priests debated whether their quantum messiah would return. In the underhives, people whispered prayers to a god who'd appeared once and might never appear again. And somewhere in the galaxy, on a world whose name has been forgotten, a child looked up at the blue star that had saved her and knew with absolute certainty that hope was real. Not because the universe was kind, but because someone with power had chosen to be. Dr. Manhattan would walk the 41st millennium now, not as conqueror or savior, but as the quiet force that occasionally made suffering a little less inevitable. And in a galaxy where even gods bled, that was the only miracle that mattered. In the grim darkness of the far future, even the smallest light casts shadows that chaos cannot touch. Sometimes that has to be enough.